we should probably do a little bit of housekeeping. I don't know, Megan, if you have an update or.
Well, just a reminder, I guess, that PeaceTrees staff are continuing to check in and monitor the situation. And when I was speaking with Claire recently, she said if anybody has questions or concerns and wants to call and talk to PeaceTrees staff, they'd be happy to field any questions.
So far,
or
so
concerns.
good. So.
I think it's just everybody's just aware that it's a rapidly evolving situation, and I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, whichever way we decide.
Right.
Yeah. So. But I think I did read a news report that they're planning to reopen the schools in March.
Yes.
So.
Oh.
So next Monday they're starting up again.
Good.
In Vietnam, they shut them down for 2 weeks, I guess. At least 2 weeks.
Longer, I think. It was, maybe it's been 3 weeks since the Lunar New Year celebration.
And it's, but low number of infections in Vietnam. But as we learn now, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, now it seems to be a kind of worldwide kind of whack-the-mole situation. So, I was on the phone with Crystal yesterday, and I repeated what we had talked about last Tuesday, that we are willing and ready to go. But on the other hand, this is something that in a week might look very different. Not necessarily for Vietnam, but worldwide, and who knows.
And I do have an announcement, not related to the coronavirus, but because of a family illness where I've been asked to be of assistance, I'm not going on the trip.
Oh.
I know, I'm very, very sad, and I'm here tonight because I love this stuff, and I'll continue to be supportive of everyone, but I just had to prioritize helping my family.
Missed on the trip.
Yes.
I can attest to Tracy being a great co-traveler from 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I was looking forward to that.
In the future.
Christoph is in full charge of everything now, I guess. You're wearing all the hats.
Yeah. Heavy duty.
I don't know if this is good or bad, guys, but
Is there any PeaceTrees staff going?
oh yeah, no, they're going to
Not
be there
from here, but.
From here?
No, not from. But well, I mean, Megan is
Right.
aware.
They're not
that-
staff.
Not
I know,
staff,
but-
like
but-
you're
but you're
connected and committed.
But we'll see the in-country staff every day, right?
Yeah. Yes, there's always somebody from the staff over there coming, but no, I didn't mean that you're staff, but I mean, you're kind of PeaceTrees. No, the staff is central to this trip. Right? Every day we're going to have at least one with us to every place. You'll get to know them. They're lovely people. Okay, so you had homework, and that is also a way for us to catch up a little bit, because we had one of our meetings, I think, wasn't it even the first one that we had to cancel? So we are a little bit behind. I wanted to get you at least into the 60s, and now it seems that it's not possible, but we'll catch it in Vietnam during the trip. But that homework of looking at that YouTube video of my Cane Hall lecture should have brought you up to speed now to 1945. And from now on, it will get a little bit grimmer. We were going at a very good clip through the centuries and decades, and we hit on all the basic features, so to say, of what you need to know about Vietnamese culture. Probably not deep enough. I mean, we really haven't talked about customs or things like that. But some of the basics of Vietnamese culture and social order, conceptions of the world around them, early history, and all that. But now, in the last 2 meetings or so, things got a little bit more, came in sharper edge, and it's a little bit darker, and that's of course not going to stop. I mean, we all know where this train is hurtling to. in the 1950s and 60s in particular, and then with a really bad finale in the 1970s. So I just wanted to use this moment where I asked you to do something online and then come back here to kind of check back with you and remind you also of how my pre-departure presentation to you is meant to be. I want to remind you that I did want to go back into some of the basics of Vietnamese culture and society and early history, but also then present you a kind of my thinking about modern Vietnamese history in its connection with the Vietnam War. And here in particular, I want to remind you that I usually do privilege Vietnamese perspectives over others. And therefore, as a device, as a pedagogical device, so to say, look at America's involvement in a kind of fresh angle. Right? And the other aspect that you will see increasingly today and next week, and then in Vietnam, is that I also use the device of kind of spatial representation to really think hard about the inbuilt structures of our narratives that we have become so accustomed to when we talk about the Vietnam War, and how I, in my pedagogy, usually here on campus, try to undermine this and get my students to understand how Vietnamese people, from various different perspectives and ideological corners, perceived of their role. Right? And that I hope will end up giving you kind of a fresh new insight into the war. And basically, you've done it already. So let me, before we continue into the French War, I just want to touch on a few of the main points of what we did not cover here, but what I covered in Kane Hall 2 years ago. And just to remind you where we ended last week, and that was my device of thinking about anti-colonial resistance in generations. We covered the first generation here very briefly because they're ineffectual, basically to set ourselves up to understanding the third one better, and also to understanding and appreciate what I call the heroic second generation. The first generation were old guys who wanted to go back in time to the old order, basically get rid of the French, not really think about things otherwise, and just continue as it was before. And they failed completely because it's a different situation. The second generation are the ones who are already initiated in the old order, but who realize, because they are the brilliant minds of their generation, who realize that going back to the old ways is futile. It will not work. And heroic, what I see them as heroic, is that they are trying in this situation of great uncertainty and anxiety, in this rhetorical field of white man's burden and civilizing mission, social Darwinism, and the kind of racism of white supremacist rhetorical fields, that they still persevere, that they still have the courage to say, no, we're going to move forward into the unknown. We might not see the promised land, so to say, but we are going to carry this forward in an attempt to, so to say, rescue the nation. Right? So they are already, many of us call them proto-nationalists, because they have a larger community already in mind. And they fail. And in my lecture, I talked about two of the leaders, Phan Bội Châu and Phan Chu Trinh, who were divided in how they set priorities. Phan Bội Châu wanted to get rid of the French activists, didn't really think about how society should work. Phan Chu Trinh was the one who was much more a reformist, who said we can't beat the French, so why don't we first really try to modernize society and then take the French by their word and hope that they will, give us independence again. naive perhaps, but oftentimes Phan Chu Trinh is seen as the first Republican of Vietnam, not Republican with a cap R, but with the first one who really thought deeply about restructuring traditional Vietnamese society in terms of the kind of modern concepts that are now percolating through the world, particularly among intellectuals. Constitutional government, republicanism, and so on and so on. Right? Now, that's the second generation. They're failing. Ho Chi Minh Nguyen Ai Quoc is the guy who connects the second to the third generation and some of his contemporaries. And so for the third generation, I want you to understand that there are two tracks. One is kind of an expat outside track of activism, of anti-colonialist activists who are oftentimes in touch with other colonized people, colonized intellectuals who are oftentimes meeting in metropolitan settings, Paris, London, Moscow, China, Japan, and exchanging ideas and learning from one another and realizing that this is a global systematic challenge, right? That this is imperialism and colonialism is not something that happens to one's individual people, but it happens on a global scale. And they see patterns behind it. In other words, ideology creeps in, right? So, and here the great transformative change is the Versailles Peace Conference, in which it becomes clear that colonialism will not be abolished despite all this beautiful rhetoric, that it is in fact race-based and it's capitalist-based. And that gives rise to a radicalization among many that we now oftentimes look back with different eyes. We see the extremes to which some of this radicalization led, right? When we think of Stalinism, say. But what we really have to understand, historical thinking, so to say, is that at that moment, in the late teens and in the 1920s, the Soviet Union, or any of these kind of Marxist critiques of capitalist colonial empires, was seen as a beacon of hope. Right? That was really a wake-up call that radicalized and politicized and mobilized millions of colonized people around the world. Right? And that is the crucial moment that launches us into the 1920s. And which brings me back to Vietnam and the third generation. Because the third generation is completely different, say, from the first one. Right? So the one thing I wanted you to take away from the third generation, first of all, is the word youth. Right? That these were young people. And when you think about traditional Confucianist elite Vietnam, youth was nothing. Right? When you were old and you had married and you had education, then people would listen to you. Then you had influence. Youth meant nothing. It was revering old people, old age, tradition, the past. Nothing wrong with this. But at this moment, it is clear to a whole young generation of activists that they cannot go back to the old ways. And they need to find new ways to organize, to adapt, and to eventually overthrow the system that oppresses them. So that is one of the things I really wanted you to take away from the 1920s, the decade of fermentation, as I call it, right? And I had little time in the Kane Hall lecture of 2 years ago, but I wanted to show in some of the slides, that everything is on the table in the 1920s. Vietnamese society is awakening to all kinds of new possibilities. For a 20th century historian of Vietnam, you could say that the 1920s is in many ways the most exciting decade, precisely because so much is open, so many doors have been opened, and people are eagerly thinking new ways, new thoughts, and comparing notes, and talking to one another. And that includes not only youth, but it includes, for example, the first really feminist wave in Vietnamese society. It means that for the first time, working people, not just in the rice paddies, but also in the emerging factories, are starting to organize. So the first labor unions. I mean, things that just 2-3 decades before in Vietnam would have been unthinkable are suddenly coming to the fore in an environment in which people realize that they are under a very unjust, exploitative, extractive regime. So the 1920s is a decade of great departure. And that is the bottom line, so to say, of going through 3 generations. Because the first generation are old people, establishment, they're looking back to the past. Second one are kind of in that fog of history searching. The third one are the brash young people, and they just say, you know, we're going to restructure our society. This is never going to happen to us again. We want national liberation, and oftentimes combined with social revolutionary restructuring. And that is that big departure of the third generation, carried by youth. And if you know your kind of Western history too, you know that in the 1920s, after that great crisis of the Great War, there was, in fact, in the West, in Western societies, a youth movement too. Right? A lot of rejection of the old, you know, from dance to fashion and what have you, sexual relations too.
Right, women's right to vote.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So women's rights and youth movement often has come together in the 1920s before being crushed again, and that happens in Vietnam as well in the 1930s. I called it a dark decade, and we don't need to really go into that right now. But you also have to understand that here we have, I should also say women, but then the big takeaway often here is the very quick rise of nationalism. Right? And theorists of nationalism, of course, say that nationalism is an ideology, right? We've been raised, of course, to think of nation states as almost natural, right? We don't question how we organize the politics of the globe, and that we're you know, from kindergarten on, we're kind of trained to think of the nation, but of course it is a construct. It is simply an ideological construct in which we find meaningful communities in those that we define as members of our nation that we belong to. Right? And that is usually done through defined borders, through oftentimes linguistic affinity, right? We speak the same language, therefore we are in the same nation. And it is also done through this intense interest of trying to push the nation back in time through a nationalist history. Right? So that was one of the themes of our meetings is that nationalist history is also a construct, and how we could, particularly when we look at early Vietnamese history, how we could find alternative ways of making sense of the decisions that people in the Red River Delta made without imposing on them a nationalist mindset of the 20th century. Right? They lived in their own way. Right? But that is nationalism too. Historical interest and an interest in defining what it means to be X, Y, and Z, Vietnamese, American, German, French, and so on and so on. Right? So defining the essence of the nation. And I didn't do this in the Kane Hall, but in my on-campus class, I come up with an acronym simply to make it easier for me to refer to what this essence of Vietnameseness is. And that is, the acronym is TORAFA. So all Giebel students over a quarter century know TORAFA as it's kind of the inside joke, so to say. And the Tarafa stands for the tradition of heroic resistance against foreign aggression. So the tradition of heroic resistance against foreign aggression. And in so many words, I've already here and there talked to you about how this comes up in ways in which 20th and 21st century Vietnamese are thinking about Vietnamese in the past. Right? That we are united. What makes us Vietnamese is that we have, through the centuries, even millennia, had an undying thirst to defend our independence, territorial integrity, unity, and so on, against foreigners who came time and time again to rob us of our independence. Okay? So that is a kind of meta-narrative that Vietnamese create in the 20s and 30s about what it means to be Vietnamese. And I showed you in some instances that this is, of course, a construct as well. We see this in the Ming interlude. We see these in the unrelenting civil wars of Vietnamese between 1500 and 1800, in which Vietnam, expanded but also splintered into two zones at civil war. That is something that nationalists don't really like to think about too much. What they want to see is unity, defending independence from threatening foreigners, and that is a tradition of heroic resistance against foreign aggression. Now, here you see exactly why nationalism is an ideological construct, because it answers precisely to the present anxieties. Right? It comes up conveniently in the 20s and 30s when Vietnam is artificially divided, right? Our protectorates and the colony, right? So artificially divided, has lost its independence, and is under a foreign yoke. And so lo and behold, how convenient to define Vietnameseness as a tradition of heroic resistance against foreign aggression. But that became a real mobilizing super fuel. And then theorists of nationalism also tell us that to have this, you have to have modern means of communication and of, Anderson says that, Ben Anderson, imagining communities over great distances. Okay? So why is the 20th century the age of nationalism? Well, because people became mobile and they could communicate through print media and telegraph and whatever, which they didn't have in the 19th century. Now, agricultural societies around the world mean that 95% of the people live in their home village, tend to their fields, and in their lifetime, most of them will never venture beyond the next market town. That is their life. Their horizon is their fields, their village, the next market town, and that's it. Okay? So there is a great immobility. Now we're in the early 20th century. France, just like other capitalist colonial empires, wants to exploit these resources. They are now putting in much more into infrastructure, trains, telegraphs, roads, and so on and so on. At the same time that people now find better ways to communicate through print media, and I made a big deal out of it in the lecture, change from Chinese character to Romanized script. And the French don't realize what hits them. The French are, in fact, the ones who are propagating using the Romanized script because it made their own administrative burden much easier. They didn't have to write Chinese characters. They could just write a Romanized alphabet, albeit for Vietnamese. But literacy, basic literacy, is so much easier to achieve when you have an alphabet. You just have to learn in Vietnam, 35 different letters. And then you combine them and you know how to pronounce them, and bang, you go. Right? Now, that doesn't make Vietnamese society illiterate overnight. It's, of course, a long process. But basic literacy, the ability to read at least basic pamphlets and to communicate that, again, in maybe some basic writing to neighbors, relatives, is exploding. And that is, again, one of the preconditions, cultural preconditions, for why nationalism becomes such a powerful force. Last thing I want to say about this is also that at that point also we have the splintering right away of the nationalist movement into ideological camps. Right? And that is, of course, at the basis of the future wars that are also always have an element of a civil war among them. And that is that by the 1930s, certainly by the 1940s, different ideological camps have emerged within nationalism. So there are the perhaps very small a group who are royalists, who maybe hope to keep on going with the dynasty that has otherwise lost its meaning, perhaps in the constitutional order. And then there are, Republicans who are thinking about Republican ways of organizing society, and then you have more revolutionary nationalists, and everything in between. I mean, even in World War II, we have some nationalists who are drifting to the far right, who become almost fascist and collaborate with the Japanese occupiers. And so nationalism is neutral when it comes to political ideology. It's a way of thinking, of imagining communities of meaning, but it's neutral when it comes to politics. That is something that, unfortunately, we have been unlearning through the Cold War, where it became a favorite trope in the West that they were nationalists who were the good guys and who usually were pro-Western or anti-communist, and then there are communists who can't be nationalists. Right? Now, I reject that. I think this is obviously a political trope, because in Vietnam in particular, we have, of course, revolutionary nationalists becoming the leading force in national liberation. So there is this diversification, and oftentimes very much at odds with one another. So in the 1940s already, we have the kind of, oftentimes violent confrontation between nationalist groups and the different contending visions for the nation. Okay, so I think moving on, we have the great change of World War II. You should all be familiar why the Japanese, when they gain admission to Indochina, why they actually keep the French in power, right? And the answer is, of course, Vichy France, right? That weird situation that with Nazi occupation in France, that there was a pro-Nazi and therefore also pro-Japanese collaborationist regime in France that then continued on when in the Philippines, in the East Indies, Burma, Malaya, and so on, the other Western imperialist or colonial powers were overthrown by the Japanese and put into their own colonial prison. It doesn't happen in China. Right? That's an important point to understand why eventually we have revolutionary nationalists led by communists become the leading force in national liberation. Because these were the only ones who said, we have to fight under Tarafa, right? Tarafa tells us that we have to fight foreign aggressors. We have to fight not only the Japanese, as the Indonesians did, or the Malays did, or the Filipinos did, but we also have to continue fighting the French. Right? If you don't understand why the French are still in charge, and there's now a triple yoke of Nguyen Dynasty French and then Japanese in World War II, you want to understand why revolutionary nationalists are actually propelled to become the leading force of national liberation, because they are the only ones who are consequentially saying we have to fight them both. The leading organization is the Viet Minh, right? The League for the Independence of Vietnam, Vietnamese Independence League, Viet Minh. And they are formed in 1941, and eventually will in 1945 become a very powerful force. So you should be familiar with the upheaval of 1945 in particular, famine on the one hand, the French overthrow by the Japanese, the last very, very chaotic and traumatic months of the World War, and then this power vacuum in August 1945. And the Viet Minh are poised to make full use of that. And what emerges is therefore the Declaration of Independence, read by Ho Chi Minh, of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Okay? So Democratic Republic of Vietnam is September 2nd, 1945. And that becomes the first independent Vietnamese state declared by Vietnamese nationalists. Now, here, I think, in my lecture, I came to the main point I wanted to make about this declaration, which I think is one of the great documents of the 20th century, because it stands for something much bigger than Vietnam itself. It stands for the realization of at least a segment of colonized peoples that colonialism is not reformable. It is an evil system through and through. It has deprived people of their dignity, and therefore has to be and should be abolished. It stands against everything that the West, in fact, declares to stand for. And again, we are in 1945 and not in 2017, when I gave that lecture, when these ideas seem to be much more acceptable, right, in the early 21st century. But again, historical thinking means we have to understand the situation back in that moment. And the thing is that the Declaration of Independence that quoted from these Western documents of freedom, liberty, inalienable rights, and therefore we have the right to abolish an evil system that denied us that, was a huge provocation. Right? Because again, we have to talk about the reality that we're still living in a white supremacist world, right? That is structured from institution to, rhetorical fields, to how power and economics are set up to profit Westerners and whites. And therefore, we have the unhappy outcome of what we now see as a completely legitimate thing to do, right? Abolish an evil system and declare independence and a new nation state is not accepted around the world. Right? The great powers in the world see this as a punishable provocation, right? That people of color will in fact abolish their interests in a colonial system. At best, what they are prepared to do is they want to grant independence. And then the grateful natives, so to say, would be on their knees and say, thank you very much. And so it is, again, that kind of delusion that the West is bringing something good to those who they oppress, and to expect gratitude from them. Right? That was, of course, the core of the rhetorical field of white man's burden. And natives, so to say, are not expected to take matters into their own hand. We grant them independence, they have to say thank you. So that's why we are hurtling towards war.
I thought it was so poignant in your lecture when you talked about the OSS agents who were actually supportive initially, right?
Yes.
Made sense to them that this is what Vietnam would want, and
Yes.
it just got squelched.
Yeah. So the reality is hit when they're coming to Washington, D.C. They're being debriefed, right? I mean, I was 25 years ago at an oral history conference that brought together old Viet Minh veterans, old OSS veterans from those times. And we did, some of us historians did an oral history and interviewed these people. And I still remember how this one guy was a very strapping young man in 1945. He was the first one to parachute into Salam airfield in Hanoi where the Japanese were. Nobody knew what they would do. I mean, very courageous, right? I mean, he parachutes down into this to take the surrender of the Japanese. They could have just shot him. He didn't. They surrendered. But, you know, he was very much in that mold and said, yeah, you know, they were just like us 170 years ago. And I was called back to Washington, D.C., and they debriefed me, and eventually somebody, and I unloaded, right? And I said, you know, we have to support them. And the debriefer eventually told him, and I will never forget that quote, he said, son, you don't see the big picture. So that was the response.
We have to take care of friends.
Yes. And again, this is not only, we tend in American narratives about the war, we tend to emphasize the anti-communist character of American intervention and decision-making. And I, as a non-Western historian, I just find this is always falling way too short. We have to understand that there's a deeply rooted racial aspect to it that goes much deeper and that sees the world in starkly racial hierarchies. And, you know, that doesn't mean that people are mean, right? But simply that this is the world that they live in. And they truly believe this. And they just cannot imagine that people of color, that they only know as servants and as laborers and people who can be ignored, are doing the things that only Westerners are assigned to do in normal life. Taking authority, making decisions, taking matters into their own hands. That is seen as deeply unsettling and indeed provoking. Okay.
Christoph, what does Minh mean? Does that mean independence? Ho Chi Minh, Viet Minh?
No, the Vietnamese term is Vietnam Độc lập Đồng Minh. So these are 6 syllables. Vietnam means obviously Vietnam or Vietnamese. Độc lập is the middle one that fell out, which is independence. And Đồng Minh means league. And then what they did is, just to make it easier, it's just they take the first and the 6th one and they combine. Okay. So that's the short form of it. So the Vietnamese League for Independence, a communist-led but broad coalition of revolutionary nationalists who are not only interested in national liberation under Tarapa, both against the French and the Japanese, but also interested in a deep restructuring of Vietnamese society towards a more just outcome. And that's the winning ticket in an overwhelmingly agricultural society, where now revolutionary nationalists are really the only ones who have a sustained strategy from the 1920s on to reach out to the peasant masses. And so you have Republicans, for example, or more moderate or anti-communist nationalists, and you can really define them in space, milieu, and class. Right? They are oftentimes middle and upper class. Many of them are teachers. They have some education. They live in cities. They oftentimes have no connection to the countryside. Right? They are engaged in their own economic activities, oftentimes commercial, profit making, and all that. But they fail. I mean, they make great contributions to Vietnamese political thought in the 20th century, but really fail to have this anchored in a large popular movement. And that is what revolutionaries are doing, and why they are propelled to the leadership eventually in Vietnam. Because, well, I mean, it's a 95% agricultural society, and if you tell people that, you know, not only national liberation, which is much more abstract, but actually their own oppressed everyday life can be changed, you will have the support of these people. Okay, so I want to, with your permission, kind of skip over the very complicated situation of late 45 and early 1946. Okay, it has to do with Allied plans that, in the wake of the Japanese surrender, the Allies basically made a line on the map at the 60th parallel, and they said the Chinese Kuomintang, so the anti-communist Republican Chinese army, will come down from the north to take the Chinese surrender and uphold law and order, and the British, Great Britain, GB, who were the closest by in the neighborhood, will do this in the south. Now, the Viet Minh have, of course, taken control of much of Vietnam. They have declared the Democratic Republic, and they declared it, of course, as good nationalists as they are, from the southern tip of Cà to the Chinese border. Right? So here is our first foray into space, right? In looking at politics in space. When we talk about the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from 1945, just like any good Vietnamese nationalist would do, is all of Vietnam. There is no division. The division is artificial. We are all Vietnamese. You can't divide us up. Dividing us up is only a measure of holding on to power. Right? Well, the Kuomintang were actually, even though they're right-wing Chinese Republican nationalists and anti-communists, but they're also anti-imperialists because they have a long memory of opium wars and all the kind of unequal treaties and all that. And so they free the French from prison, but they are not really giving them back power. Whereas the British, as crusty colonialists, are immediately doing that. And that creates problems in the South that will lead to outbreak of violence. I think I talked in my lecture a little bit about it, how the British are rearming Japanese POWs, put them under British command, free the French, and these combined forces then drive Viet Minh out and up north. Right? So by late 1945, in this very difficult situation, the southern half of the Democratic Republic, which I will now privilege because I simply say this has much more legitimacy than the French Indochinese colonial regime. The southern half of the Democratic Republic has come under French control. Right? So in the north, the situation is a little bit more difficult because here the French are itching to go back, but they're not let back because the Kuomintang is there, so the Chinese anti-imperialist and anti-communist ones. And then you have a communist-led revolutionary coalition of nationalists who are holding on in the northern half, where they are very strong. Right? So the popular support for the Viet Minh, for the leadership of the Democratic Republic, the Viet Minh, is very, very strong in the north, very solid in the center, much weaker in the south. Why? You know why, right? Because of the different trajectory that Cochinchina as a French-ruled colony took from 1865. Okay? So the solution to this problem of the French trying to get back north, the Kuomintang trying to stay, and the French and the Viet Minh caught in the middle, is that the Viet Minh and the French have an agreement in early 1946 to allow the French in with a limited number of troops, 15,000, that's all. In exchange, that's a quid pro quo, in exchange for the French recognizing not the independence of the Democratic Republic, but the French would recognize something that they called the Free State of Vietnam, in which they would give them limited autonomy, but not full sovereignty. So the French would still be in charge of military affairs, foreign affairs, and finances, particularly. So the three big portfolios. But the Viet Minh government would have some kind of a status. So that is the kind of a, you know, the smallest common denominator that they can find. And that early 1946 agreement between the French and the Viet Minh means that the Kuomintang has to leave, okay? And I'm sure that behind the scenes, the French are paying a huge amount of money to the Kuomintang generals to leave too, okay? I don't want to spend very much time on this because I do want to get into the war years now. And for us to really get into the weeds of the situation between September 1945 and December 1946 would probably take 2 hours. But so the basic outcome here is that the Viet Minh are also quite wily, because with the Kuomintang had come anti-communist nationalists who were exiled in China during World War II, and they were demanding to be included in the government. Now, Ho Chi Minh, as the president of the Democratic Republic, had indeed included them in his coalition government, but the stress of already political, ideological conflict was emerging among Vietnamese nationalists. And the Kuomintang were the protectors of anti-communist Vietnamese nationalists. So by allowing the French back, who were hostile to anybody who wanted independence, including the anti-communist nationalists, they made a deal with the devil, so to say. They allowed the French back in, but it came at the great benefit of forcing the Kuomintang back to China, and therefore their nationalists were without a protector. Okay, so in the summer and fall 1946, therefore, the Viet Minh are also consolidating again their hold over the Democratic Republic vis-a-vis their internal ideological competitors. Okay, but here we go to the second example of how space is conceived and how that leads into politics and conflict. When the Viet Minh and the French have this arrangement of early 1946 for the French to come back to the north under limited numbers, and then in return they would agree to this so-called Free State of Vietnam, not the DRVN, but Free State of Vietnam. They couldn't agree on one thing, and it will not surprise you what this one thing is. Cochin China. Cochin China. Okay? So, good nationalists that they are, Vietnamese, the Viet Minh, and actually everybody else, of course said Cochin China should be part of our Vietnam. You took it from us under unjust circumstances in 1865, unequal treaties, gunboat diplomacy, and that was part of our kingdom, and for our independent democratic republic, we want it back. It's of course not negotiable. These are our fellow citizens, right? Compatriots. And we're not going to give them up. And the French say equally, why? Cochin China has been French since 1865. It has not been part of your Vietnam. And when we talk about the Free State of Vietnam, we of course mean former Annam and Tonkin. So this early agreement of 1946 rapidly falls apart. And it falls apart about different spatial dimensions of how politics should work. Okay? So that will be kind of our theme moving forward. Right? So there is supposed to be in France in the summer of 1946 a follow-up conference at Fontainebleau where they would talk about the final status of Cochin China. The French are in no mood to make any concessions. They find that the war is over, they are now back in charge. Cochin China has always been French. The Viet Minh are weak. They have plagued government, but we don't really have to make any concessions, particularly not about the status of Cochin China, which is of course the big crown jewel of French Indochina. But Vietnamese nationalism demands that there's no compromise, right? And therefore we go to war. And that war breaks out December 19, 1946. And so that's the beginning date of the first Indochina War, or what we call maybe the Franco-Viet Minh War. The Vietnamese will call this a war of national liberation, and it's certainly from a French perspective a war of reconquest to fully regain control of their homeland. And it will last until May 7, 1954. And that is the date of the unconditional surrender of the French command at Dien Bien Phu, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Okay. And we won't get to that today, but next time we'll get to that. Right? So these are just in the raw data, raw dates, the contours of that war that is fought over who is going to rule Vietnam. Okay.
Is that pretty much a guerrilla war?
We'll get to that. Okay. So when we talk about that long war of more than 7 years, I have to come up with mental bridges, okay, for my own good too. And I usually divide the war up in 2 very distinct phases. And the first one is 46 to 49. And the second one is therefore 49, 50 if you want to 54. And they're quite distinct. And to make that even easier to distinguish the one from the other, I'm thinking about 3 terms. And these 3 terms to remember for each of the 2 phases. In the first one is isolation, open, and stalemate. And in the second half of the French-Vietnamese War, or French-Viet Minh War, the 3 words are integration, close, and, well, this is 2 words really, but revolutionary offensive. Okay? So we go from, the military term is stalemate in the first phase to a back and forth, but the overall trend is an offensive by revolutionary forces to Viet Minh. In terms of the international context of the war, we have the great isolation of the Viet Minh in the first half of the war. And then the integration of the war into the emerging Cold War, where 2 camps are glomming on to the Vietnam War and make it part of the larger Cold War. And in terms of the Viet Minh's appeal, we're having a very open first phase, broad nationalist appeal. And then once the Cold War comes to Vietnam, we have a much more closed leadership of revolutionary nationalists that are clearly aligning now with the communist camp, either by design or by circumstance, by lack of alternatives. Okay, so these are the kind of the broad headlines of that first Indochina War that preceded the American War. Okay? 2 distinct phases with 3 distinct headline terms. So it's 6 o'clock, so maybe this is actually the perfect moment to break for a few minutes, 6-7 minutes or so. And then I will talk to you about the first phase, and that will include a pretty deep look into guerrilla warfare. and what that actually means. Multiple reasons, but one of the basic reasons is that there is no understanding between the French concept that Cochinchina was theirs, was not on the table, that there could be some kind of an autonomy arrangement for the rest of Vietnam, free state in the French Union or something like this, but Cochinchina was theirs. And likewise, Vietnamese, the Viet Minh here, they had declared the Democratic Republic, and that of course was naturally all of Vietnam. There was no negotiating over Cochinchina. They would not abandon the southern compatriots in Saigon and beyond. The breakdown of trust, of course, as well. Racial hatred perhaps as well, in which the French could not conceive of Vietnamese as, in fact, agents of their own destiny. So the outbreak of war pits against one another a independent, declared democratic republic, but of course with weak forces. Okay? They had just barely 15 months of independence, what they saw as independence. They had basically no allies. They had very few organized forces. The French come in. They are back in charge. They have a conventional modern army. The United States is now already aiding the French return through American troop transport ships that they allow the French to use. So it pits against one another a straightforward conventional army, a modern army, against a more ragtag, what we might call third world force. And the Viet Minh, of course, are very much aware of this, and they have seen by, say, September or so, 46, that this was probably going to end in warfare. And they had taken now already measures to prepare for that. And that meant that particular in the north, where popular support for the Viet Minh government was very, very strong, particularly after the famine relief of 1945, that you should be aware of from my lecture, that the Viet Minh are taking measures to move their administration from Hanoi in the lowlands back into the guerrilla bases that they had already used in the northern highlands against Japanese and French forces during World War II. Okay? And some in the central, and then petering out in the south. Right? So you see, in terms of the strengths of the Viet Minh, a very clear north-south differentiation. Right? So they had, in fact, before December 1946, moved whole ministries out of Hanoi and back into the highlands, into the jungle valleys of the northern rugged terrain, in preparation for what they could see was the eventual breakdown of relations with the French. So the French start this war supremely confident. They think that there's no way that the Viet Minh could resist longer than a few weeks.
You say they start, as opposed to the Viet Minh start.
Well, it's not really clear who shoots the first bullet, but it's clear that French intransigence over Cochinchina makes war inevitable. And at the same time, it's also the French inability to really see Vietnamese as agents of their own destiny. And so the war is actually precipitated by a pretty devastating massacre that the French forces conduct in Haiphong Harbor in November 1946, where they shoot point blank an armada, French Navy force, point blank into Hanoi, Haiphong Harbor, and completely level the Vietnamese neighborhoods. And the estimates is that about 10,000 people will die because Haiphong was one of the smuggling points for Viet Minh arms. Right? So you see by November that there's basically no basis anymore for any valid dialogue between the two sides. And then it just, eventually, it is on the 19th of December that the first bullet is fired. Now the Viet Minh in Hanoi have a rear guard left, which is basically a suicidal rear guard action, but which buys the Viet Minh about 3 months, 2 months, I would say. And that is still very much revered in revolutionary discourses in Vietnam today, that a rear guard in Hanoi bound the French to Hanoi for 2 months before the French were actually able to fully control Hanoi. And when we are in Hanoi, you will see why, because there is a core central Hanoi, the Vietnamese neighborhood, which is a warren of very small, narrow alleys and roads. So the old commercial Vietnamese center, as opposed to the wide alleys of the French neighborhood of Hanoi, which I will show you as well in an afternoon walk, where I will show you some of the French aspects. But be that as it may, the French will have a hard time really gaining full control of Hanoi. They have to fight street by street, alley by alley, house by house to gain control of Hanoi and evict and kill the last persisters of the Viet Minh. And that rear action allows the Viet Minh main force and the government to entrench themselves back in the guerrilla bases of the Northern Highlands. Now, how do we get to stalemate? We get to stalemate because during 1947, the first real year of the war, the French are trying several offensives into the highlands. And all of them will eventually fail. So the French are unable to dislodge Ho Chi Minh and his government. They come very close in October. They actually parachute into a valley. They have good intelligence, but Ho Chi Minh and his lieutenants are able to, at the last moment, slip out of that valley and into another base. But all of these offensive actions in 1947 will not have success in decapitating, so to say, Viet Minh leadership. Right? So by the end of 1947, the war, which in particular is focused on the northern theater, there is not very much action taking place in the rest of Vietnam, is settling into a stalemate. A stalemate that pits guerrilla forces of the Viet Minh against conventional forces of the French expeditionary force.
And at that point, is the U.S. helping the French?
No.
Okay.
So maybe some logistical support, but there is probably a broader consensus again in the American government, particularly under Truman, who was much more pro-French than the anti-French Roosevelt, FDR, that the French were in many ways are closer to American thought worlds and to what felt comfortable and what felt normal. Right? So we can talk about Cold War strategies, that France was the cornerstone of an anti-communist strategy in Europe, that France had the largest communist party in Western countries, that therefore there was a US desire to not undermine kind of a French sense of self-worth and to sustain a pro-Western French government. But I think underneath it is deeper, right? Underneath there is this kind of a race solidarity as well. Right? And that's what I tried to bring out in that.
Right.
I don't know when's the appropriate time for talking about it, but it seems that both sides had religious philosophies, cultures, part of it being Catholic and certainly French being Catholic, but a smaller amount of
that will become more of an issue towards the end of the war.
I'm not thinking of it as an issue, as a matter of the opposite. How about pulling them together? Why wouldn't that pull them somehow together?
I don't think that religion plays too much a role at that point, But when it comes to concluding the war in the Geneva Accords, that's when religion really plays a big role, particularly Catholicism. So I would like you to hold your thought until next Tuesday, when this becomes more apparent. So guerrillas against conventional army, and here, Megan, you already asked about it. I want to take a few minutes just to think about this in abstract terms, what that means. And the situation is a pretty classical one for guerrilla warfare, and that is there is a homegrown resistance that is obviously militarily not able to defeat a conventional enemy force on the open battlefield. They would be crushed. They simply don't have the armor, they don't have an air force, they don't have an organized infantry, that has trained for a long time, particularly in territorial warfare, where you have a front line that is moving and the territory behind the front line has been secured. Right? So that is the way in which conventional forces are set up. They have been trained in that. They're very good at it. So guerrilla forces who are, however, entrenched in that local landscape and in the local population want to avoid the open battle. Okay, so the one thing that they have going for them, however, is popular support, and they know every nook and cranny of that territory. Okay, so here we go for the three major rules or laws of guerrilla warfare. And I don't have a military background. I don't consider myself a military historian, but I do come up with what I call the laws of guerrilla warfare. Okay, for better or worse. The first one is, so you want to avoid direct confrontation. You choose your battles. Okay? So when guerrilla warfare works, that's the first one. Right? When guerrilla warfare works, we must conclude that an overwhelming percentage of the local population is either in support of guerrillas or are the guerrillas themselves. And this is basically a mind experiment. So if we think you have 50% of the population in a given district supporting you, would guerrilla warfare work? My thesis would be no, because 50% is obviously a very, very sizable portion of the population, maybe even 51. You have the majority behind you, but you have 49% who are either fence-sitters or actively against you. And that's a huge amount of potential people who rat you out to conventional forces and give away where you are, and you are bound to be bombed by airplane or whatever. So therefore, my first iron rule of guerrilla warfare is, and that's simply a mind experiment, that if you have, say, 70% of the population behind you, and 70% and some of that is actually actively engaged in guerrilla warfare, your chance of winning this guerrilla warfare, of having success, is pretty high. Because now you have only 30% who are either fence-sitters or working against you, and part of guerrilla warfare is to make sure that those who potentially work against you are intimidated or silenced, right? So conventional forces look at some guerrilla tactics and they see terrorism, targeted assassinations. Right? Now, from a conventional point of view, that is then oftentimes denounced as terrorism. But it is essential for guerrilla forces to operate because they have to make sure that their one strength, which is popular support, is not undermined by the few who might be working against them. Okay? So that's number one. Where it succeeds, we can assume that guerrilla warfare in that any given locale has overwhelming public support. Because otherwise, it wouldn't succeed. Best example, the end of Che Guevara. Okay? The second iron law of guerrilla warfare is that conventional forces must win. And the third law, and I'll explain number 2 and 3 together. The third iron law of guerrilla warfare is that guerrilla forces must not lose. Okay. And this is something that will apply until 1975. Okay. Even though we're in the late 40s at this point. So what about number 2 and 3? Why is it that conventional forces must win and guerrilla forces must not lose? Well, because guerrilla forces cannot win. They simply have no viable paths towards militarily defeating organized, powerful conventional forces, including air force. There's no way. So therefore, what they have to do is create a quagmire, stalemate situation. And a stalemate situation works for them. Actually, it will become eventually successful because of law number 2, which is conventional forces must win. Not winning is losing, because conventional forces originate from far away. They are super expensive to maintain, and they will also have a morale problem. Okay? Because conventional forces are operating in an alien environment, and propagandistically they have been told that their cause is just, that they're doing this for freedom, liberation, anti-communism, what have you, all high-flying rhetoric, and also that they are expected by the population to do this for them, and therefore the population will be grateful when they arrive. Okay, so that is obviously, the French Expeditionary Corps is not told, come back because we want to grab Indochina for our, exploitative tactics. No, they are of course told, the Vietnamese are waiting here, they're communist rebels and terrorists, and they're just waiting to be liberated by us, the white guys who are, liberators, riding in to rescue the poor people of Vietnam. Right? Now, they are confronted, of course, the longer it takes, by the realization that many, if not most, Vietnamese don't want them there. They're not people who are throwing rose petals and chocolates when they come. Quite the opposite. Right? So you have military morale, you have huge amounts of costs that eventually will erode support in the metropolitan society for the expedition. And you have the expectations of a conventional army that it will actually hold territory and push front lines further. That is not how guerrilla warfare works. Now, guerrilla warfare is, of course, targeted attacks where the weakest links in the conventional force is. Oftentimes, just shoot a few bullets, melt back in either into your tunnel in the rice field or into the population at large before they can even shoot back. Okay? There is no territory to be defended or held or front lines because they simply don't exist. Confrontation can happen at any moment, or maybe for a long time there's nothing. Right? It's the unpredictability of the situation, and that wears down conventional forces. So conventional forces must win, and if not, if it drags on and on and on, then the cost eventually in this kind of cost-benefit valuation back home in Paris or later on in Washington, D.C., that balance will increasingly tip towards saying, why are we doing this? What is in it for us? And this is not only military leaders who will ask these questions, not political leaders behind closed doors, but increasingly also the public. Okay? So guerrilla forces have it easier. Of course, they take the brunt of violence. They have huge casualties, probably 10 to 1 at least, right, in conventional, as opposed to conventional forces. So I don't want to belittle this, but they have it easier, so to say, because they must not lose. It's not that they have to win. They simply have to hold the French at bay. And over time, this will solidify the situation and open up cracks in the French forces. Okay. And guerrilla warfare also has its inbuilt dynamic of spiraling violence. Right? So let's take a French soldier with his buddy from middle school, whatever, right? And they're in some kind of an outpost up there in the Northern Highlands, and there's a guerrilla attack out of nowhere, unannounced. There was no indication ever before. Market activity maybe down the road in some village, and a few shots are fired, and your buddy from high school or middle school lies dead. Right? So, of course, you are in a foreign country that you poorly understood, that you were indoctrinated to think in different terms, but now you're just angry, hurt, afraid. Right? And so what happens is you learn the lesson that you can't trust these guys, because this is over in 5 minutes, and then seemingly down the road, the market activity is just going on, right? So how can they not be aware that there were some guerrilla fighters in the neighborhood and all that, right? So I'm trying to paint this picture, abstract one, but of an imagined situation. The next time you are in a situation like that, and somebody could be suspicious, right? As they say, you shoot first and you ask questions later. So in other words, the threshold for military violence by conventional forces in a guerrilla warfare situation that is protracted is getting lower and lower. But that has a dynamic of reinforcing that spiral of violence, because then you have a situation where, say, some peasant in a rice paddy in Vietnam gets shot by a trigger-happy French soldier who is angry from the attack of last night that killed his buddy. But that was the breadwinner of the family, or maybe an uncle, a beloved uncle, and it only then radicalizes the population of that locale. And they are now, if they haven't already, they were fence sitters, so to say, now they're actively supporting the guerrillas. They become guerrilla fighters, right, to exact revenge on the foreign aggressors, on the invading forces, as they are told what the French represent. Right? So you see this dynamic playing out in guerrilla warfare, and therefore those three iron laws. The first one, where it succeeds, and it succeeds up there spectacularly, we can assume, therefore, very, very strong popular support. And that coincides, of course, with our historical knowledge, particularly the support for the Viet Minh in the aftermath of the famine relief of 1945, Declaration of Independence, which is an electrifying moment in all this. And guerrilla fighters must not lose, but conventional forces must win. Right? And so that's why we have the stalemate. And stalemate is not good for the French.
Christoph, what's going on in the South during this time?
Not very much at this point. Most of the military action in 47, 48 is more in the north, and some of that in Central Highlands. The Viet Minh are trying to revive some of their bases from World War II in the south, too, at this point. But there's not much action. so to say.
Is the population split in the South though? Are there some who are,
I would say that Cochin China is pretty much, I mean, if you're in the city, if you're a kind of middle class city dweller, your life might not be that bad. It's pretty much unaffected. And we'll get to how this anti-communist nationalist stratum of Vietnamese society becomes organized in these years very soon. Okay, so let me build this up. Okay, so isolation is the second term, and that is the complete isolation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the first half of the French-Vietnam War. Too much to their chagrin. Don't want to spend too much time on it, but just to give you an idea of what that means, nobody has officially recognized the legitimacy of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Where would that recognition come from in 1947, say? And so the most obvious one would be Stalin, Soviet Union. Well, Stalin, at the height of his dictatorial regime, looks at Ho Chi Minh and he finds him too wishy-washy. He's not an orthodox communist, way too much nationalist, so to say, and it's also far away. The Soviet Union is particularly interested at this point to rebuild from the devastations of World War II. After all, the Soviet Union, like China, had the greatest number of devastation and victims to mourn. And they're interested now, the Soviet Union, in building a Western string of satellite states in Eastern Europe to prevent another attack from the West, right? Soviet Union had been attacked from the West several times since 1917. So that's why, from a Soviet point of view, Eastern European kind of satellite countries under communist control. So that's where their focus is. And here they just don't find enough to say, this is somebody that we can call, a close ally. The United States, right? Ho Chi Minh has sent several letters to President Truman. We don't know if he ever got them. For sure, we know that there was no response. Right? So by 1947, the so-called Truman Doctrine is formulated. Harry Truman says that anybody in the world who is under communist insurgency threat will be supported by the United States. Right? It's a little bit of a departure because in this case, the example in which this happens for the first time is Greece, which is under military right-wing fascist dictatorship. But no matter, anti-communism becomes now an overriding principle, and therefore the Cold War becomes institutionalized, systematized through the Truman Doctrine. In response, the Soviet Union formulates the two-camp theory, which does exactly the same, only on the other side. Right? So the line is drawn between the two uncompromising Cold War camps in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine and the two-camp theory. So the United States equally is not in a position to support the Democratic Republic, even though there are some lingering American misgivings about French colonial attitudes and what have you, but overriding is the sense Ho Chi Minh is too much a communist to be worthy of our support. Right? So for Stalin, it is not enough. For the United States, he is too much. Okay, so that's another one. Where else would support come from? Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong. Well, in 1947, that is in fact the low point of the communist fortunes in the Chinese Civil War. The Communist Party in 1947 has been evicted from their stronghold of Vietnam in central China, has been reduced to Manchuria, to the far northeast, furthest away from Vietnam as it can be. Kuomintang seems to be, in 1947, actually close to winning the Civil War. Well, little side note, you may know this. Of course, the fortunes drastically changed by a year later, by late 1948 and early 49, when suddenly the Communist Party is going on an offensive and they're Kuomintang is just collapsing on the mainland. Right? But we don't know this. In 1947, Chinese Communist Party is not recognizing the Democratic Republic. They have much more immediate concerns to deal with, and it's far away. Right? So non-aligned people, well, Thailand, the newly independent India, Pakistan, and so on. Well, there's some arms smuggling. There's certainly some sympathy among recently decolonized people about the anti-colonial struggle. But again here, many of them are non-aligned in the Cold War, and they feel or fear that support for the Democratic Republic would draw them into the Cold War confrontation, would make the Americans actually be hostile to them. In Thailand, the case is also that because of, or through American intervention, also a right-wing military dictatorship is installed about that time. Finally, the most obvious ally of the Democratic Republic is not pulling through. Who could that be? So I had a slide in my Kane Hall lecture online, and that is of young Nguyen Ai Quoc, later to be called Ho Chi Minh. And he, in 1920, became a founding member of the French Communist Party. So what about the French communists? Wouldn't they be actually helping the Democratic Republic? And the answer here is no. Because the French communists are first and foremost nationalists as well, and they're also, in their own circumstances of their time, maybe unacknowledged, but they are white supremacists. And they have a colonial heart in many ways too, because it's so beaten into this overall system in which people interact across racial lines.
And very intellectual.
Yes, okay. But the greatest ire, the greatest anger that the Viet Minh reserve for any potential ally for not recognizing the legitimacy of the Democratic Republic and for not recognizing the independence of Vietnam is reserved for the French Communist Party. Why? Because they come across as exactly these paternalistic white guys who say, why are you rocking the boat down there so much? Because we French communists are in fact, in 1947, that is still true for a few months. From 1945 to 1947, we are in a coalition government. We are actually part of the governing coalition of France. And you guys, making a ruckus, declaring independence, taking up arms against us, are only making our job, working for you, harder. Right? Now, if you're a colonized person, right, you must understand how infuriating that is, because it is exactly that paternalism that we white guys know better. You don't have agency. You shouldn't get agency because we are the ones who will deliver for you. So don't rock the boat. And so that is the greatest disappointment for the Vietnamese revolutionary nationalists, that the French Communist Party is not working for them. And when they do, in 1949, they're out of the government and can't do that to effect change. Okay? So isolation, and therefore closely connected, openness. So in the first half of the French-Viet Minh War, the Viet Minh are acting as truly the spearhead of national liberation. They are the one big power that is welcoming any patriotic Vietnamese into their fold as long as they want to defeat the French and defend the independence declared and for national liberation. So their ideological inclination towards social revolution is downplayed in these first years radically, and they are presenting themselves as a broad tent for anybody who is patriotic and wants to liberate the nation. Okay? So I want to get us to 1950 in 15 minutes. So back to the military situation. Okay? So And that openness, I should say, is also quite successful. We know that a lot of people who were not communists, who were of middle class origin, city slickers, so to say, many of them actually decide out of a patriotic sense of duty to slip into the resistance areas and make themselves useful. Okay? So we can say there is a certain aspect of civil war, but it's very muted at that point. It was more clear in 45, 46, but now it's very muted because of that French threat. Okay? But the French are confronted in early 1948 with the realization that the illusion of a quick, decisive military campaign that will end this and they will be back in charge is exactly that. It's an illusion. And there will be many parallels to the American situation. And so fast forward, 1948 is a similar moment to 1968, except that in the American phase of the war, everything takes a little bit longer. Okay? It took the French about a little bit more than a year to realize that a military victory alone in Vietnam will be impossible. And it takes American intervention in 1964, 65, and then a sense from then on until early 1968, where the whole military strategy of the United States was to actually win outright, right? Military victory. That was what military and political leaders in the United States were talking about until 1968, right? And then there's a big change. And we'll get to that eventually. Just to give you a heads up, so to say, of the parallelism in the situation. So 48, the French realize we will not defeat them by military means alone. It's a stalemate. And they know that stalemates are not good for conventional expeditionary forces. So what do they have? The only option that you have at that point is to open a political front and try to divide the population that is so fervently supporting your enemies. Parallel to 1968, where for the first time, the United States is seriously now pursuing negotiations. Right? Again, we're not there yet. So in 1948, the French reach out to the non-communist or anti-communist nationalist parties who had been, so to say, on the sidelines of this conflict. And they make them an offer. And the offer is practically the same offer that they made in early 46 to the Viet Minh. We give you the free state of Vietnam. You have a lot of autonomy in ruling over this free state. However, we keep sovereign rights over defense, finances, and foreign affairs. But we make you this offer of a very generous offer of certain autonomy. And in 1948, actually it starts in 47, but it doesn't matter, right? 48 is the crucial year. What do these anti-communist nationalists respond? What do you think?
No.
They say no.
That's what
And why do they say no? Space involved, because just like in 46, in 48, the French say it does not mean Cochinchina. And as good nationalists, communist or not, they cannot conceive of a rump Vietnam, right? This is simply unacceptable. So they say no, even though they would have, although their strength vis-a-vis the Viet Minh is much weaker, they had a golden opportunity to, in fact, gain a state, limited sovereignty, but nevertheless. They say no. They have to go back to the drawing board. The French are unwilling, particularly because of colonial interests in Vietnam, in Cochinchina, not so much in Metropole, by the way. Oftentimes, hardened positions on the colonialist side are determined by colonialists in the territories. By 1949, another year has passed, stalemate continues, costs are mounting. The French population is starting to become tired of the war in Vietnam. They're starting to say, why are we wasting so much resources, our young ones in the rice paddies of Vietnam, for what? When we should actually have these resources to rebuild France after World War II. Right? What is in it for us? They were telling us that they would welcome us with gratitude, and yet they're fighting us. Right? So exactly that kind of drip, 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 this mission creep of conventional forces confronted by an organized guerrilla situation is coming to bear. And so in 49, finally, the French give in. Okay? So in late spring, early summer, they give in and they say, okay, Cochinchina is part of that deal of a limited sovereign, autonomous French, Vietnamese state where the French still have a measure of sovereign rights. Okay? So here again, you see the power of territorial concepts in the politics of the day. Okay? So Cochinchina cost the French, so to say, a year before they were able to build up a counter-government to the very popular Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic. So what happens is, in late 1949, officially we have the birth of the so-called associated state of Vietnam. Okay? So I like to abbreviate ASVN. In some of the literature, you see simply SOV, so State of Vietnam. But I don't want this confused with South or anything like that. So ASVN, it is for me to make it clearer. But also because Associated State of Vietnam is exactly how it was set up. It was associated to France through the French Union and through limited sovereignty. So in other words, the French create the conditions for anti-Vietnamese and anti-communist national Vietnamese nationalism to create its own counter-state to the Democratic Republic.
And that includes the entire territorial
Yes.
piece.
So this is a crucial moment because I'm jumping ahead here. Many of you might be aware of the Geneva Accords, 1954, that end the First Indochina War. And this is the basis for one of the most enduring American mythologies about the Vietnam War, or tropes, if you want. And that is that Vietnam was divided at Geneva into two. And next week you will find out that this is not true, okay? But that is an enduring mythology, that there was, so to say, a creation of North Vietnam and a creation of South Vietnam. I have air quotes, right? Very, very academic. The crucial moment, however, is if we really want to talk about a political division of Vietnam, we have to realize that the moment is, in fact, 1949 and not 1954. And it happens not in a territorial division, but in a political division of two exclusivist and eliminationist states. In other words, we have a situation in which we now have to draw the map of Vietnam as if you had double vision, okay? So this is how I draw it for my students in my campus class, right? So this is not a very good one. Let's do purple, how's that? So my purple pen here. And I'm drawing the contours of Vietnam in this kind of double vision a double vision way. Okay? So in other words, we have, as of 1949, a political division of Vietnam that encompasses the whole territory onto which two states are projecting their claims of legitimacy and sovereignty. Many of my students laugh already at the typical arm movements of Gibe, which is, here we have the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, from the Chinese border to the tip of Cà Mau, 1945. And as of 1949, we have built on top of that the associated state of Vietnam from the tip of Cà Mau to the Chinese border, basically projected onto the same territory. Okay? So in 1949, we have actually the beginning of a formal division of Vietnam, but not in territorial terms, but in political state terms. And these two states, of course, are completely opposed to one another. They don't recognize each other. They all claim for themselves only sovereignty and legitimacy, and therefore want to eliminate each other. So that's why I use the terms two exclusivist and eliminationist states that are mutually, what is the term? Mutually exclusive, right? Mutually exclusive. So sometimes you find wrongly in the literature that the associated state of Vietnam was actually a southern Vietnamese state. This is not true, but the government actually resided in Saigon. So you see here again a bowing to the reality that as of 1865, particularly the South, Cochinchina, was the arena for the building up of a whole new social stratum in Vietnamese society that was very different from traditional elites that had acquired wealth and influence, and therefore were also anti-communist. They felt much safer, much more secure, so to say, in their bastion of Cochinchina, rather than in Hanoi. So Hanoi continues to be the official capital of the Democratic Republic, although under French control. So the Democratic Republic is dispersed in guerrilla areas in the north. And Saigon becomes the capital of the associated state of Vietnam. Right? But in terms of territorial and sovereign claims, we now have two exclusivist, eliminationist states contesting the same all Vietnamese territory. And that is something that in our discourses about the American phase of the war, about the Vietnam War, is oftentimes overlooked. Right? That the situation of this division of two contending states that claim all of Vietnam is, in fact, going back to 1941. Okay, so we have 3 minutes. So I want to step into 1950 in these 3 minutes. Okay, and that is, we're now at a crucial moment. October 1949, Associated State of Vietnam. If you travel just a country up north, you know that October 1949 is also a very crucial moment because that is the end of the Chinese Civil War. The Kuomintang is escaping to Taiwan, and the mainland comes under complete communist control. The Chinese Communist Party wins the mainland, and Mao Zedong in October 1949 declares the People's Republic of China. And that has great consequences. But for our purposes in the last 2 minutes of our meeting today, it has immediate consequences for Vietnam. Because until then, in the brief moment of life of the associated state of Vietnam, nobody will recognize them either. So the Western countries, I mean, communist countries will of course see this as a kind of a puppet of imperialism, whatever they call it. But even Western countries are unwilling to recognize them because it is so clear that it is a construct by the French with some willing help, of course, of anti-communist Vietnamese nationalists, but nonetheless, it is a construct of the French, right? So, but now we are in January 1950, and Mao Zedong is the one who is the first to recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as the legitimate Vietnam, as the legitimate state of Vietnam. Right? So the victorious communist Chinese new state, the People's Republic of China, is recognizing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And because Mao is a challenger to Stalin, right, a competitor to Stalin, now Stalin cannot hold back. And he is challenged, and he takes the challenge, and the Soviet Union is now also recognizing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. They, as the other communist superpower, don't want to be upstaged by Mao Zedong. And all of the Soviet satellite countries in Eastern Europe are all recognizing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as the only legitimate state of Vietnam. And February 1950 comes around, and all the Western countries are now in unison recognizing the associated state of Vietnam as the sole legitimate state of Vietnam. In other words, we're in 1950. We are now in the second phase of the war. Isolation gives way to Cold War integration into the two blocs. And what happens militarily is something we have to face next week. And that's it.
Complex.
Mhm.